Welcome back to part 4 of the engine rebuild series for my 4.9 Ford. If you haven't yet seen parts 1, 2, and 3, check out that playlist up here. I've got the shop all cleaned up, so without further ado, we're just going to jump right into this. So I'll be the first to admit that I'm a novice at this, and as I've gotten started on this reassembly, I've already noticed one real issue that I'm actually pretty worried about, but I think we're going to be able to correct it. And you can see there's a whole lot of surface rust developing here. Throughout the block, we've had some surface rust develop. The cylinder bores look okay, but on the bearing races for the crankshaft, we have some rust, and we also have some rust showing up on the actual crankshaft itself, which is really not great. So what we're gonna have to do is go ahead and get this cleaned up so that we'll be able to make sure that we have smooth mating surfaces for everything. And then we also need to be sure that we're able to measure our clearances properly and make sure that we have the right clearances so we get good oil pressure. So it's really important to keep a clean work surface because you don't want any grit, dirt, metal shavings, whatever else you might find in a shop. You don't want any of that to get on your mating surfaces for the bearing journals and races. And so I've done a really good cleanup of the shop. I mean, the best I can given the fact that this is an old van body and I've got just wood plank floors. And I've got this nice plastic desk cover that I'm going to be using here to work on. So I've cleaned that off just with some Windex and paper towels. So we've got the grit off there. So let's go ahead, bring this crankshaft over and see if we can get the bearings cleaned up. Oh, man, those things are heavy. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna try and clean up these bearing surfaces using just some shop towels. I'm hoping that this rust will rub off. I know that people have made suggestions online about using 600 grit sandpaper or using maybe double or triple zero steel wool, but I'm hoping that we don't need to get any abrasives out for this, so we're not actually taking any material off or potentially scratching the bearing surfaces. We are just removing that surface rust. So let's get to it and see how it goes. So we've cleaned up the crank pretty well. Things are looking pretty good. There's a little bit of rust left in what appears to be tiny pits on the crank journals, but I'm confident that it'll be all right because I can't feel the pits with my fingers. So let's move on now to the block and do the same thing. We're just gonna try and clean out these bearing journals a little bit. I'm less concerned about these because there's not actually any movement against them. However, I do need to make sure that the bearing seats itself all the way and isn't elevated due to rust. So let's clean this up with our lint-free rags. Okay, like I said earlier, I really am a novice at this. I've only worked on small engines before, never automotive stuff. So I've got my handy dandy Haynes manual here, and it says that step one is installing the crankshaft, which makes sense to me. So looks like what we're going to do essentially is we're going to install the crankshaft without any lubricant and do a test fit to measure and make sure our bearing oil clearances are good, and we're using Plastigauge for that. We're going to lay a strip on each bearing journal, and then we're going to totally torque it down. We're not going to turn the crankshaft, and then we'll take the main bearing caps off and check our Plastigauge strips and make sure that our basically make sure that our clearances are okay for the oil passages. So that makes sense to me. So let's get started and see how it goes. So this is what comes in a box of bearings for my 4.9 Ford. We have, it looks like, bearings with a tab in the center. What'll that be? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. Bearings with a tab on the left, and then one bearing with a tab in the center, one on the left, and that's like, I think this one's called the thrust bearing for the crankshaft, and it goes on the number 5 cap and saddle. So I think we've got one package that goes into the block. It looks like not these ones. Center tab goes into the caps, left tab goes into the block. You can see the notch on the left here. So let's go ahead and get that started inserting them. We've got the block all cleaned out. There's no dirt or lint or anything on these seats, so we're okay to go ahead and put in the bearings. Okay, so we're ready to install the bearing caps onto the crank. And what we're going to be doing here is not final assembly, so there's no lubricant. We're measuring to make sure that there's enough clearance for the oil to essentially adequately lubricate the crankshaft bearing journals and generate enough oil pressure. And to do that, we're going to be using Plastigauge. Now, this is my first time using Plastigauge, so I'm not going to give you a tutorial on how to use it. If you want a tutorial, look it up on YouTube. There's a ton of them. But the gist of it, from what I understand, is we're going to break off a little strip of this stuff, set it on each one of those bearing journals on the crankshaft, bolt down the main bearing caps onto the crankshaft, torque them up to spec in the proper sequence, and then remove them. And then we'll check and use the gauge on this Plastigauge to essentially determine how much squish there is on the plastic and that will tell us our approximate clearance. Okay, so it's the moment of truth. We got these bearing caps off. We're going to take our plastic gauge. You can just cut a little bit off of the gauge and we're going to hold it up. So on this one, it's hard to see. Looks like it's lining up pretty well with that one, which is the 0.003, which is not as tight as I think I would have liked. I'll have to check the clearance, but we'll go ahead and check another one. Again, 0.003. It's consistent if nothing else. .003. This one's getting into 002. .002. Again, 002. And another 002. Okay, welcome back. It is another day in the shop. I stopped working on this build after I did the plastigaging, and I decided to just leave it at that point. I wanted to talk to my machinist and clarify the clearances I was seeing, and also talk to him about the cam bearings, because to me they looked a little wonky, a little chewed up. But anyways, talked to him this morning. Got some clarification that he likes to give 2 to 3.5 thousandths on the main crank bearings in terms of oil clearance, so we're within that spec, which is great. And then the cam bearings look a little bit chewed up because the block is warped. So the block deck is flat, but the actual block itself is warped, and he couldn't actually get the camshaft in when he did a test fit. So essentially what he's done is he's gone in there and he's reamed out those cam bearings, and he said they're super soft like butter, so that's why they kind of take scratches. So his suggestion was, if I want it to look a little prettier, use some Scotch-Brite. You can't hurt it with that. So I'm gonna go ahead and just touch up these bearing journals one more time on the crank with the Scotch-Brite, and then we'll go ahead and actually install the crank. My hope for today is to get that crank installed, so let's get started. Okay, so we've determined that our crankshaft is a good fit. We've cleaned up the bearing journals on it with some Scotch-Brite to just essentially make them as smooth as possible, as polished as possible. And so the next step is to do the final installation. So again, I'm not showing you guys how to install one of these. I'm just showing you how I install it because this is my first time doing it. So what we're gonna do, according to my instructions, we're gonna put a thin amount of assembly lubricant on each of the bearings here. And then we're gonna plop in the crankshaft very gently. And then we're going to put a bit of assembly lubricant onto the main bearing caps after cleaning them. And then we're gonna start tightening them down. Simple as that. So let's get to it. So at the recommendation of my engine builder, we're just using Lucas oil stabilizer. He said it's nice and goopy. He uses it on race engines and everything. So it's a great option and it's easy to come by. So my manual puts an emphasis on a thin layer. I don't know. We'll see. That looks good. It's not overflowing with oil. Good amount. Squeeze it on, let it run down. The bearing will really only hold so much, you know, like it'll run out of an ability to hold more oil, so I think you probably can't really overdo it because it'll just run off. So this number 5 bearing here is the thrust bearing, so I gotta make sure I coat the outside surfaces too. A little extra on there. Okay, that's the main bearings done in the block. We'll transfer over our crankshaft. Again, being so gentle. Okay, there we are. Next step. Okay, we got to make sure that these bearing caps are clean of Plastigauge, which I have not done yet, so let's take care of that. Okay, so now we're going to confirm the bearing is clean, which it is. Confirm the journal is clean. It's as clean as it's going to get. And then we're going to install some of that same lubricant. Okay, and then it's very important that this bearing cap, that I'm gentle with it first of all, and second of all, that it gets installed the correct way. So it's got a number 1 and an arrow pointing this way, which is the front of the engine. Okay. As my manual so nicely puts it, make sure there's no dirt on your bearings because there's only one way it can go, and that is directly through your brand new bearings. So now we're coming on to bearing 5, which is our thrust bearing. This is one that we gotta be really careful with because there's lots of parts of it that have to be perfectly spotlessly clean. Lots of faces. Okay. again on the journal face, but also the thrust face here. And this thrust bearing essentially keeps the crankshaft from bouncing around forwards and backwards in the engine, while the journal faces of these bearings keep it from bouncing around up and down in the engine. You only need one thrust face, I'm presuming, because the dominant motion of the engine is up and down, and so there's not a whole lot of front and back happening. Carefully. Okay, so next step, we're going to go ahead and finger tighten all these bolts, make sure the bearings are all seated. And then there's a special torque sequence we have to go through, which I'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so start from the center and work your way out forwards and backwards. The bearing we have to pay very special attention to right now is this thrust bearing on cylinder, or I guess it's not cylinder, on bearing number 5. And we have to pay special attention to that because it doesn't want us to actually torque it down yet. All we're going to do is we're going to finger tighten it, so we'll do that right now. Okay, so next step, we're going to tighten all bearings except the thrust ones to their final torque, which is 65 foot-pounds. We're going to do that in 3 steps. So I'm going to do 20, 40, 65, going through the pattern all the way to the end. 20, repeat that for 40, and then repeat for 65, leaving this just finger tight. Go this way. We'll leave number 5, so we'll go to number 6. That's 7. I'm gonna just make this bearing cap. I'm gonna do it just finger tight. Okay. Then we step up to 40. Okay. Start again on center. Okay, so that's 6 out of 7 main bearing caps torqued to 65 foot-pounds, which is our final torque. To recap the instructions, tighten all except the thrust bearing cap bolts, which we did. Tighten the thrust bearing cap bolts finger tight. They are now. We'll confirm. Yeah, I can loosen that off. So finger tight. Pry the crankshaft forward, and while holding pressure on the crankshaft, pry the thrust bearing cap backward. Forcing these two in opposite directions against each other will align the thrust-bearing surfaces. While keeping forward pressure on the crankshaft, retighten all the main bearing capholes to the torque listed in this chapter's specs, starting with the center cap and working outward. Rotate crankshaft to check for binding. Okay, you good there? Oh, it's squeezing through. It's such a weird thing. Okay. Torque on this bearing that wants me to do it in steps instead of tightening one down at once and then the other over. So that click means that we hit the proper torque. Okay, you can let go gently. Let go. That's good. Thank you so much. So that's the moment of truth. Does the crankshaft spin? Whoa! It spins! That's so exciting! Awesome, right? It spins freely. So happy. That's a big step for me, getting that installed. Well, let's go eat some dinner.